Well, Professor Rana Mitter is Chair of US-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School.
I think one of the major takeaways is that the outcomes and the major strategic objectives of the FOCAC meeting very much tie up with one of China's key geo-economic tasks at the moment. The idea is that essentially building up supply chains and trade relationships with the wider world, particularly the global south, is going to be important. Because trade relations with the US and EU are currently very fragile in many ways, sub-Saharan Africa is seen as a potential growth area. And one of the interests in basically making this series of loans, which have been flagged up in the FOCAC announcement, is to try and stimulate that kind of extensive trade relationship, particularly in areas such as green energy and also areas where China is looking to export its products.
And how has China positioned itself as Africa's development partner of choice, especially compared to Western countries? And is there a notable shift away from those big-ticket infrastructure projects that China was involved in that garnered so much attention over the years?
I think it's fair to say that there's been a really big shift away from what we saw back in the 2010s, which was those classic sort of concrete mixer infrastructure projects. Of course, those still very much exist, and you can see countries like Ethiopia where products like high-speed rail have been introduced over the last few years. But I think the story is different now. It's very much about green energy transition at its heart. This is an area where China feels that it has technologically a strong lead, and is able to use its capacity in areas like solar power, which of course is an energy source from which Africa in particular, with a lot of sunny weather, is able to draw on very effectively, as well as looking at areas such as 5G, in terms of telecoms and cyber provision, and also actually areas such as pharmaceuticals and vaccines. So in some ways, the new Chinese strategy is much more focused than it was and has moved away from infrastructure, but it's still very much about embedding itself within the sub-Saharan African emerging economies.
And President Xi Jinping announced the creation of at least 1 million jobs in Africa and more than $50 billion in new financing for Africa. How crucial are these investments for those African countries themselves, and will they be on terms that suit them?
Well, one of the ways that we're going to know that is how the investments are actually used. And the story is mixed. It has positives, it has negatives. If we look at both Western and Chinese investment in Africa over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years, we see success stories on both sides. So, that could be the building of infrastructure in areas such as transit, power stations, and so forth. But on the same token, we can also see that there are projects which haven't always gone so well. Investment on its own isn't enough. You have to have both a really well-embedded plan with the governments and societies where the investment's being made, and an overall strategy to try and eventually bring those products to usefulness and profitability. So it's a mixed picture, but there's plenty there for people to learn from, I'd say.